Hello, dear viewers. We have reached the climax of our story, where all the secrets will be revealed and the fates of the heroes will change forever. In the previous episode, we witnessed shocking events that turned the lives of our heroes upside down. Brett and Randy were drawn into a new, dangerous world, full of intrigue and temptation. What awaits them at the end of this exciting story? Get ready for unexpected turns, passionate revelations, and deep psychological analysis. Find out whether our heroes will be able to find their place in this new world, or whether they will collapse. Don't miss any of the episodes. Just subscribe to our channel. This motivates me to voice more and more stories so that my viewers get what they really want. How the hell did this? Chapter 3. Brett drove slowly through an unfamiliar part of town. Finally, he saw a number on a building and pulled into the parking lot. He was dressed the same as Randy. Dark pants and shoes, a black button-down shirt, and a black sport coat. Gloves and a hoodie were in his pocket. As he got out of the car, a petite woman a little younger than him came out of the door, closed it, and smiled at him. "Brett?" "Yes." "Cherry?" "It's me. Come on, I'll drive. I know the way." He nodded. She turned to the car parked a little farther down the street. It was a brand new Dodge Charger Hemi. He was impressed. Before starting the car, she dialed her cell phone number. She spoke only a few words. "We're on our way." She brought this monstrous automobile to life. It rattled, and she drove it to its limits. Despite her small stature, she handled the car like a professional. "Randy said I should tell you about how it will work, and what to expect." "Yes." "It's set up like this. You're the dominant, and I'm your subordinate for the night." He looked at her. "I have no idea what that means." "Don't worry, follow my directions, and everything will be fine." Randy wants you to watch him, and how he behaves, reacts, and interacts with people. Pay attention. Randy is a master of his craft. There is no one better than him. You can also observe the other dominants. For the most part, they will be dressed the same way you are. They will act just like Randy, but when you finally start to see the difference between him and them, you will understand. Since I'm your subordinate for the evening, I'll be right next to you. We'll have a little rope, never let it go. Why? With few exceptions, a man who lowers his submissive is essentially telling everyone that she has disobeyed or frustrated him to the extreme. In extreme cases, he strips her of all her rights and she becomes a free submissive. Is that a bad thing? She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. It can be a terrible emotional experience for a submissive. No good submissive ever wants to disappoint his master. Being released immediately is like a curse. No real master will ever want to own her again. He furrowed his brow in thought. It's a whole different world I'm about to enter. Better be on your guard. What if I have to go to the bathroom? She turned to him and grinned. Then I'm coming with you. His eyes widened. Randy told me about the situation with your wife. She will be there tonight on a leash as well. Randy intends that after he leaves with her tonight, she will have a change in attitude that will transfer to you as well. It is important that you begin to emulate Randy in how you behave, how you interact with people, and how you think they should treat you. He looked at her with sort of glazed eyes. Don't worry, you'll get it and you'll be fine. When we get to the barn, put on gloves and a hood. I'll get ready and we'll go inside. There should be a few people there by now. Just be cordial and friendly. Randy suggested you not speak. I'll do the talking for you, making the excuse that you have severe laryngitis. What should I call you? He stared at her dumbly. I think I'll call you Daddy, sir. He blinked. She pulled up to one side of the building and parked. Put on your gloves and hood. Give me a second to get ready. He began pulling the hood on and adjusting it. It took him a few minutes to get it smooth and even. Then he pulled on the tight-fitting gloves and turned to see her standing outside the door waiting for him. The light coat she was wearing was gone. She was now dressed in a blue brocade corset under her bust, blue stockings, and equally blue shoes. She held out the rope to him, lowering her eyes. I'm ready, Daddy, sir. He took a deep breath and headed for the door. Cherry obediently followed to his left and a step behind. Inside, Randy was waiting for them. He looked at Cherry, then at Brett. Sir, may I have a word with your submissive? Brett heard the question, but didn't realize what it meant. He managed to pull himself together and nod, remembering what he had been told about how to speak. Brett listened to Randy talking to Cherry. The tone was formal and polite, but something was off when he was talking to her, unlike when he was talking to Brett. There was a sense of expectation in it, a sense of, well, mastery. Brett felt a sense of control that only Randy's voice could provide. Did Cherry get all the instructions? Yes, sir. Do you realize what I want tonight? Yes, sir. Are you willing to follow my example if the situation changes? Yes, sir. What are you going to call him tonight? She grinned. He's a daddy, sir. Randy chuckled. Cherry, you're adorable. He turned to Brett again. Thank you, sir. I wish you an informative evening, and if there is anything I can do to make it more enjoyable, please let me know. He nodded, and Brett nodded. Cherry stepped close to him and whispered, Just socialize. If people want to talk, nod at me and I'll do the talking for you. I'll apologize for your laryngitis. He nodded and led her to the bar. He had already decided he needed a drink. He ordered a scotch, pointing to the bottle, and watched as the bartender poured a fine single malt scotch on the rocks and handed him a glass. He looked at Cherry and nodded. Can I have some water, please? The man held out a bottle of water to her. They withdrew. Several people introduced themselves to each other over the course of the evening, and Cherry did a wonderful job. Everyone was cordial and friendly. Most expressed, it seemed, a general uneasiness about his illness. He noticed that manners and etiquette were precise and strict. He began to catch a glimpse of the presence of men. Each of them, to one degree or another, possessed the same strength of character that Randy radiated. He met some women who behaved in much the same way. As he walked around the room, he began to feel the aura of power that these men and women carried within them. He heard the sound of the microphone and turned to look at the stage. Cherry walked right up to him. He felt her touch the back of his hand. Instinctively, he reached back to touch her. Standing on the stage at the microphone was Randy. Good evening, friends. Welcome to our little family reunion. Dinner will now be served. The game area will open 90 minutes after we begin serving dinner. Our dungeon masters for tonight will be Dawn, Robert, and Angela. Brett watched as 3 people stepped forward. 2 men and a woman. The men were dressed more formally, in tuxedos, and the woman was dressed in a long black evening gown. She was clearly not someone's subordinate. In fact, he noticed several women who had submissives, both male and female. Randy left the stage just as the servers began to bring the buffet to the serving line. People started lining up. Cherry leaned toward him. It's better to get in line. You'll have a choice. You can feed me from your plate or let me take my own. He nodded. He was constantly observing. He saw how the submissives reacted to the dominants. He saw how the dominants reacted to each other. Cherry watched him closely and smiled, noticing the subtle changes in the short time they had spent here. Randy had told her that Brett was smart, a quick learner, and although Brett himself didn't realize it, had all the qualities of a dominant. She watched him, wary lest he make some serious mistake, but soon relaxed. He was acting a little differently. He seemed more confident. He led her to the serving line, and as they approached the plates, he took his own. She looked up at him. He shook his head, refusing. She smiled. He piled food on his plate and led them to a table at the back of the room, away from the main table. Randy appeared from the side door, leading a woman on a leash. Brett realized it was Pat. He wished they weren't so far away. It looked like she was handcuffed. Randy led Pat to an elevated platform, and she stepped carefully over the threshold in extreme shoes. Randy sat down, and Brett saw Pat disappear behind the desk. Brett pushed his chair away from the table and noticed that there were only 4 chairs at tables that normally seated 8 people. The answer to that question came when Cherry repeated the action. It wasn't long before 3 other couples joined them. It was awkwardly silent. He made a quick decision and spoke hoarsely before Cherry could speak. Thank you, Pet. My throat feels better. I think I'll be able to talk a little. She stared at him wide-eyed as he started talking to the others. The transformation was barely noticeable, but Cherry noticed it. He was carrying on a pleasant, albeit hoarse conversation. Topics ranged from sports to business. Brett was somewhat surprised that the dinner conversation was the same as at any other dinner party, until the woman seated to his left turned to Cherry. How did you meet little Cherry? Everyone here is wondering how she ended up with you after the last party. Cherry held her breath. Brett took a sip of water from his glass. We were introduced by a mutual friend. There seemed to be a connection between us. My friend noticed this and invited me to attend tonight, and Cherry agreed to keep me company. Oh, so they're not permanent? Cherry, eyes wide and not realizing what was about to happen, shifted her gaze from the woman to Brett. That, I think, has yet to be decided. Suffice it to say, she would be a great addition to any family. Couldn't agree more. So do half the dominants in this room. Most of them have tried to lure her in at one time or another, but she seems determined to remain free. Cherry finally sighed as the conversation turned to other topics. Brett continued to feed her dishes from his plate until she felt satisfied. At one point, he leaned over and brushed a small flake of dough off her chin with the corner of his napkin. She looked up at him and saw something in his eyes. She suppressed a sigh. He immediately lowered his head to hide his gaze from her. When the meal was over, people began to gravitate toward the game area. Brett saw Randy get up and take the microphone. Dungeon masters and mistresses. The play area is open. Brett watched with interest as groups of people formed around the various stations. At one point, the crowd parted for a moment, and he caught a glimpse of an interesting scene. He immediately stood up and pulled on the leash. "Let's go." She stood looking at him, concern written all over her face. He walked over to the play area and joined the group, watching the scene. Cherry was watching Brett. Because of the hood covering his face, it was hard to make out his expression or reaction. Brett stepped aside, and Cherry followed him. He walked slowly, looking at the various scenes, but as Cherry noticed, he was watching the people more than the game. Cherry walked over to him and quietly explained how it all worked. He nodded and watched. Brett watched. When he finished, the woman seemed to be in some sort of daze. He looked at Cherry. She snuggled up to him. She's in the subzone. The endorphin levels in her blood are off the charts. Just as Cherry had predicted, the man let the woman go. Brett paid particular attention as the man walked her to a table near the edge of the play area, sat her down, and pulled her to him. She pressed herself against him, and he began to talk to her. Brett saw her smile. At that moment, the crowd seemed to part. Brett saw Randy leading Pat down the center of the playground. Brett stepped behind the other people and pulled Cherry behind him. He watched Pat walk past. The extreme corset was beautiful, and the way she walked was almost obscene. In the center of the court, Randy stopped. "It's Pat. She's an arrogant, bratty fool." Her own words. She cheated on her husband and treated him with disrespect at every turn. Tonight, I ask you, my friends, to help change her attitude. Show her how decent people should treat each other. If any of you would be so kind as to help me prepare her. Several people helped Randy. There she is, friends. Teach her well. Randy walked over to Brett and Cherry, who were standing in the distance, and turned to look. The crowd buzzed around for a bit, and then a man stepped forward and opened this marathon of instruction. Brett watched almost with horror. He spoke softly to her, gently touching her tear-stained cheeks, and then kissed her forehead. For a moment, Brett was confused. Brett pulled Cherry by the arm and placed her in front of him. She was petite and couldn't see well, so he placed her in front of him. His hands rested on her waist. She lifted her head and looked up at Brett's face. His gaze was fixed intently on the stage. She leaned back slightly and felt his hands tighten around her waist. Pat, who was having trouble breathing in her corset in this position, listened to what Randy was saying. She didn't fully understand what was about to happen. Her mind was racing with fragmentary thoughts. Fuck. Oh shit. What's going on? How I got into this? Why didn't I leave when... Brett leaned in close to Cherie's ear. What are they telling her? They teach her what it means to be both loved and owned. There is comfort and happiness in both of them. Together you can find bliss. Each of them has something different to tell her. How to be happy while serving, how to be respectful, how to bring joy to herself and others. But most importantly, they show her that, despite what she may think, she is loved, cared for, and protected. He leaned toward her and spoke softly. Do you have that in your life? She lowered her eyes to the floor and answered quietly. Not yet, Papa, sir. Someday I hope to be cherished and owned by me. I felt like you had a lot of opportunities. Not the ones I wanted. Submissives always have a choice of who to serve and when. Brett straightened up and turned his attention back to Pat. Cherry felt him move and sighed, then realized that his hands were now on her shoulders and he was pulling her against him. The other man was kneeling by Pat's face, wiping the snot that dangled from her nose with a handkerchief. He spoke softly, almost cooing in her ear. "Oh, God, please let this be over." What's he saying? Am I loved? What does he mean? Someone beats me to death and then says he loves me? Damn it. This is a nightmare. How can he be so gentle? Brett turned his attention to Pat, watching as the man and woman brought her to the point of agony and then gently and tenderly expressed their concern and understanding for her. Cherry had long since stopped paying attention to what was happening. She restrained herself by closing her eyes and leaning back against him for support. When the dominants were almost finished, Randy leaned over to Brett and spoke in a whisper. "Your turn." Brett raised his head and looked at Randy. Randy nodded and looked toward Pat. Brett stepped forward. One of the dungeon masters started to step forward. Randy shook his head, ordering him to stop. It was as if Brett was possessed. Every frustration, every insult, every taunt that Pat had ever spewed at him seemed to burst out. Cherry reached out and touched his arm. He felt like he'd been electrocuted. He looked down and realized. Cherry, placing her hand on his arm, nodded. He stopped and walked Cherry over to Pat's head. He knelt down and touched her face with his gloved hand. He spoke to her, and recognition flashed across her face. "Please, somebody help me, please. I can't do this." She knew there would be a moment of respite when another voice filled her ears with platitudes of care and tenderness. She was confused. She was tormented by her inability to separate the pain from the touch and the words. His thoughts centered on the repetitive litany. "Please make it stop. Please make it stop. Somebody help me. Somebody save me. Please make it stop. Please make it stop. Please make it stop. I'll be good. I'll be good. I'll be good." A new voice reached her. Something clicked in her crowded mind. That voice. Those words. Who is it? Why does it sound familiar? When Brett saw this, he pulled the hood off his head. She looked up at him and sobbed. Brett stood up and nodded to the two men standing nearby, and they immediately released her and lifted her to her feet. Pat leaned against Brett and continued to sob. He pulled her to him and began to speak softly to her again, touching her gently. The crowd erupted into applause. Pat sobbed openly on his chest, repeating the same words over and over again. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry." Brett saw that Cherry was crying too. Randy came over and stood beside her. "Good job, buddy. I think it went well." Randy took Pat's rope and held it out to Brett. Brett looked at it and smiled at Randy. "Sir, I believe she is in your care until tomorrow evening. This pet is quite satisfactory to me, and I believe she will be happy to continue doing so for some time to come." Randy looked at him with renewed respect. "Sir, you are correct. I would respectfully request that you and your pet accompany me and my ward home after these festivities for some quiet conversation and perhaps some entertainment." "Sir, I think that's a great idea." Brett looked at Cherry, who stood, eyes wide, and then at Randy. "If you can accommodate us, we will spend this evening and tomorrow with you." Cherry's mouth dropped open when she heard, "We." Randy smirked and almost reverted to his best buddy image, but held back. "My pleasure, sir. I'll see you tonight. Please enjoy." Brett nodded as Randy walked away with Pat in his arms, head down and silent. Brett felt Cherry stand up beside him. Her attitude and behavior were different this time. "Sir, can the pet speak? I need to ask you a couple questions first." "Yes, sir." "You said that it is always up to the submissive to decide who and when to serve." "Yes, sir." "Perhaps I spoke presumptuously. Would you accompany me as my submissive for the rest of this weekend?" "Sir intends to take the pet?" He looked down at her. "It is." She smiled, but immediately a cloud descended over her face. "May I speak to you frankly, Papa, sir?" "Of course." "What about your wife? Will they let me go after the weekend?" "My wife will do what I tell her to do, and take what I tell her to take. As for you, I think that will be decided as the weekend progresses." Cherry blushed slightly. She was amazed at the change in Brett in just a few hours. Sir, this girl doesn't want to be just an affair or weekend entertainment. She needs to be loved and cherished. She wants to belong to someone, not just be a toy. Her eyes were downcast as she spoke. Brett heard the deep emotion behind her words. He lifted her chin to look into her eyes. You belong to yourself. You are loved. I think since you touched my hand and gave me back, I own you. She sighed, and then her face spread into a wide grin. Much later, the crowd dispersed and the cleaning crew got to work. Brett sat at the table near the door, and Cherry stood beside him. Her head rested on his thigh, and his hand moved slowly over her shoulder. He watched Randy walk across the floor with Pat to his left and slightly behind him. They came to the table and stopped. Ready to go, buddy? Oui. Pat looked at them and at Cherry. Randy looked at the petite young woman as well. I've heard rumors that you're claiming something. The rumors may turn out to be true. Brett, you amaze me. You've gone from depressed husband to confident dominant in a matter of hours. I had 2 good teachers, so how would it work? Have you thought about it? I've been thinking about it. I have a wife and you have a big empty house. You know that what belongs to me belongs to you, and what belongs to you belongs to me. I propose that these 2 are like everything we've ever had. I suppose there's no reason for either of us to have big lonely houses now. Randy grinned. You're even thinking like a dominant. Come on, let's go to my house. Randy took Pat to the parking lot, and Brett took Cherry. As they approached Cherry's car, she started to make her way to the driver's seat, and he yanked the leash again. She stopped, and he held out his hand. She bit her lip and held out her keys to him. At Randy's house, Brett and Cherry stood in the living room and looked out the window at the darkening valley. Cherry snuggled up to him, and he put his arms around her. He still held the leash in his hands. He reached out and unhooked it from the collar. Cherry lifted her head with a question in her eyes. We're pets. We don't need a leash at home. She smiled softly. Randy appeared from the back of the house. Pat obediently followed him. He stopped at the other end of the room, then went into the kitchen to get a beer. Brett, want a beer? Of course. Cherry disappeared into the kitchen and returned, carrying a beer and a coaster. She handed him the beer and he nodded. Randy came back and looked at Pat. Pat, you should go say hello to your husband. She turned, walked over to Brett and looked up at him. Hey, Brett. Hi, Pat. Randy spoke again. What did we talk to Pat about? She took Brett's hand. She was almost sobbing. Please, Master, forgive me for being a fool. I promise I'll be good. Brett looked at Randy. Brett took Pat's hand. Don't let it happen again. Yes, sir. Brett pulled Pat into a hug and kissed her. Brett pulled away and looked into her eyes. What have you learned? She lowered her eyes as she spoke. Sir, I realized that I've always wanted to be respected. Before Randy, no man had ever demanded that of me. It took me a while to finally realize that. Her eyes rose to his. When I saw your face next to mine, all I could think about was how much I hope you'll be like that. I want you to be like that. I want to respect you. Good girl. Randy has taught us both a lot. I think our world is going to be a whole different place now. Pat smiled. Brett looked at Cherry, who was nibbling on her lower lip. He could see the worry on her face. Pat, this is Cherry. I have a claim on her. She agrees, but since I now know that the decision always rests with the submissives, I have to ask you, are you willing to serve me and accept her into our relationship? Brett talked to Cherry too. Cherry, you also need to realize that Brett and I are closer than brothers. What belongs to me belongs to him, and vice versa. Are you ready to accept his ownership and be paired with Pat? Cherry moved toward Pat, who was still snuggled in Brett's arms. Pat wrapped her arms around Cherry's waist and pulled her to her. Cherry felt as if she were glowing with a new light. Dad, sir, I can't imagine a more ideal situation. Randy stepped forward. Pat, why don't you and Cherry go to the pool and get to know each other better? I think you'll spend a lot of time together. Pat looked at Cherry, and holding hands like schoolgirls, they went to the pool. Randy went to the window next to Brett and looked out at the dark valley. Brett, even I'm amazed. I knew deep down you could be a good dominant, but I had no idea how quickly you would transform. That little arrangement you just described didn't even cross my mind, even though we shared everything else we've ever owned. Yeah, I don't think it's much different. No, what's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. Brett looked at Randy with a wide grin. Can I borrow a Bugatti for next weekend? Randy looked at him, and they both laughed. And so we come to the denouement of our story. What does the ending hide? It turns out that the world our heroes have plunged into is full of hidden rules and unexpected twists. Brett, from an ordinary family man, turns into a confident and charismatic leader. Pat, after the trials he has experienced, gains new strength and confidence. And Randy appears as an experienced mentor who skillfully manipulates reality. We have witnessed not just a story about dominance and submission, but about deep psychological transformations. Each of the heroes has gone their own way, faced limitations and fears, but ultimately found their place in this unusual world. The ending leaves us with a sense of satisfaction and reflection. It shows that even in the most unusual circumstances, a person can find their happiness and gain inner freedom. This story is not just fiction. It makes us think about the boundaries of what is permitted, about the nature of power and submission, about what is hidden behind the facade of everyday life. I hope this story has stirred up a storm of emotions in you and made you think about many things. Share your impressions in the comments, discuss with friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for new exciting stories. Epilogue. Life goes on. Brett and Pat build new relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. Randy remains in the shadows, observes, and, perhaps, prepares for new experiments. And the world they plunged into continues to exist, hidden from the eyes of ordinary people. This is just one of the stories, one of the tips of the iceberg. The world we told you about is full of secrets and mysteries. Perhaps someday we will reveal new facets of this amazing world. Thank you for being with us.